I'd like you to join me in welcoming the distinguished panel. And again, our focus is the future of water in Texas. We all know that last year we faced the largest or the most significant single-year drought in Texas history. It's brought it to the attention of everyone throughout the state, but especially as you remember that as we move forward over the next 50 years, we expect a population to increase by some 75%. And that increase in population and the demands for food, for commerce, for industry to help support that is going to place more demands on water. And we are faced with, especially after the drought, will we become increasingly sensitive to droughts, and will it limit the future of Texas and the economic development of Texas? So these are the topics that we're going to discuss over the course of the next hour. And I thought I'd just begin with a very basic question, and perhaps have each of the panel address it from their own perspective. The basic question is, do we have enough water, or is it more of a concern about appropriately allocating it and distributing it across Texas? And perhaps, Representative, if I could ask you to
Sure.
start our discussion off.
We definitely need some new water in Texas. If you look at what's happening in West Texas, where the lakes have dried up, they're transporting water as far as 175 miles into some urban areas. There is a lot of opportunity in reuse as well as in conservation measures if we have uniformity, and I think that's something that we've got to focus on, where we had in the drought of 2011 folks using the same water source and in different stages of their conservation plan. That indicates that there's some opportunities there as well.
Perhaps, Amy, your own thoughts on this initial comment.
Well, I guess that I'd have to qualify that question a little bit and say water for what? So, if the question is, do we have enough water for all the ways that we use and abuse water now going into the future, I would say, as is, the answer is probably no. I think one of the challenges, in addition to perhaps some new supply measures, as the representative mentions, is really starting to think about water in a different way. And part of the way it's beyond conservation. It really is sort of thinking about how we use it and what we use it for. So, I would just sort of add to the previous comments that we can reallocate water, but we can't create more water. And I think that that's something that we always need to remember. We don't have the ability, we're not alchemists, we can't invent water. So whenever we take from another water source, move things around and reuse water, we always have to think about who or what is going to be impacted by that rearrangement of systems. So I think that's really wherein lies the challenge.
This is a big deal. Our population is going to double in the next 50 years or so, and yet we've already given permission for more water to be withdrawn from many of our rivers than is actually in them. And so we definitely got a problem. We have a system that in some cases, particularly in terms of the way we allocate water, goes all the way back to when we were a colony of Spain, and yet we bear no resemblance to the state in the years past. For me, I agree with what has been said, that we're Texans, so we should be optimistic that we can get ourselves out of this, but we can't build our way out of it. We really have to change our culture and our procedures. The example that I like to use is we treat water as if it were a different substance when it's underground than when it's on the surface, and it's the same water. But yet we tell someone who's a landowner in the hill country that the water is theirs, and we tell a community or a farmer down the river that the water is theirs. And yet it's the same water, but we treat it completely differently. And so there's a number of those kind of things that we have to address if we're going to find our way out of this.
Becky.
I think I agree with just a whole lot of what's been said, but I think it highlights that everybody has different perspectives about water. So do we have enough water? I think for the state, the growth that we're experiencing, we're going to have to find ways to develop new sources of water. And I agree, you can't invent water, but there's a lot of water in a lot of forms that can be captured, and I don't know that we've done that. I also agree that we've got to educate and inform and change attitudes about how we use it. People complain about, water for agriculture, but yet they're watering, lawns. And we need to make sure that we serve all the needs, because everybody needs water in some form or fashion. Just capturing water that runs down the rivers and goes into the bays and estuaries, it's above and beyond what's needed. So finding ways to capture the water that we have, finding ways to treat water that's currently not really potable or usable. So I think for the future, we're going to find the solutions because we are Texas. But I think there's things that we have to do as citizens is not look at this so locally. It's going to have to be Texas helping to solve Texas's problems and looking at this collectively and not, county to county or basin to basin.
In that regard, do we see the solution to the water problem somewhat like energy independence, that is going to take a whole range of solutions all combined to try to address this, whether it's conservation, whether it's reuse, whether it's new supply? And anyone feel free to chime in as they feel appropriate.
I would say yes. I mean, and I think that that's a very important point, because what I see is everybody sort of looking for the silver bullet that's going to get us out of this. Desal was the prettiest girl in town during the drought, and reuse or whatever, and then we get blamed for saying conservation too much. And the reality is it's going to be a little bit of everything, including the culture shift that Becky, to which Becky refers. And part of that culture shift isn't just the individual usage, but as she mentioned, it really is starting to, and sort of playing off what Andy said as well, it really is starting to think about water, regulating water in a way that comports with the science of water. Reallocating the same molecule just because it's in two different locations is just not going to work. And so it really is a statewide issue, and it's one that we want to look at sometimes regionally. Municipalities get blamed because they only care about themselves. Rice farmers get blamed because they only care about themselves. But it's the same water that they care about. So that the only way it's going to get solved is if both of them are working together.
In the drought of the 1950s, which we refer to as the drought of record, everybody lived in a small town or on a farm or on a ranch. They had a parent or an aunt or an uncle that was on a farm, and so when the drought got bad, everybody knew it. Everybody felt it, and it was a profound impact on our society. Today, I think our people believe that as long as they can go into the kitchen or the bathroom and turn on the tap and water comes out of it, that everything's okay. And it's fundamentally going to require a complete shift in our understanding of what this resource means to us.
Our planning, if you look at the Texas Water Plan, it's the compilation of 16 regions have come up with what they think they need in their immediate region. I think the flaw there is we need to look at 30,000 feet and start looking at projects like they did in the 1950s when they looked at the topography of the land, and then they started developing surface water projects, and they were brilliant. The engineering, they were able to capture those watersheds, but we need to now look at worldwide the best technology, the best methodology on bringing new water to bear. I think if you look at Lake Travis, it's a good example of why you shouldn't store water above ground when you have an opportunity to store it underground. And we've got 5 billion acre feet, I think, of aquifer storage in the state of Texas. We're utilizing about 130,000 to 135,000. Let's look at it, what they're doing west of Texas. Nobody builds surface water. In Florida, they don't build surface water projects. They're putting the water underground. And what Becky said, if you got these mighty rivers that are flowing into the Gulf, and on an average year like the Brazos, where they're putting 6 million acre feet of water into the Gulf of Mexico, their E-flow requirements are 500,000 acre feet. Why aren't we taking that water out and storing it underground? That's what they're doing in all the states west of us. So I think that you don't see that in the regional water plans because these projects are big in scope, but they could benefit so many people, both from an industrial base, from a municipality, as well as the ag users. And so that, and then the desal. And if you look at some of the large projects that are on the drawing boards now, there's a lot of opportunity to do that as well. So the Texas, if it's the state water plan, the state of Texas needs to be engaged and not just be passive and encourage and regulate these 16 regions. I think there is a hybrid of the bottom up and then having some play with the folks at the state level being involved in implementation of some of these programs.
And I think, to your question again, I certainly, all of the points here are valid. And it's a comprehensive look at solutions, because after the drought of record in the 50s, people did, get together and, built significant amounts of reservoir storage. I do agree with Representative Larson that we have to be mindful that water evaporates. More water evaporated out of Lake Travis in 2011 than the city of Austin used. But also, from our perspective at LCRA, it appears that close to 1 million acre-feet of water in 2012 alone will go into the Matagorda Bay. That's above and beyond what's needed for environmental flows. That's the size of Lake Travis. So if we can find ways to even capture that 2 or 3 times a year, they've had significantly more rain downstream than we've had above to fill up the lakes. So taking different approaches, whether it's capturing excess flows or utilizing aquifer storage, whether it's looking at where desal makes sense, we're going to have to look at all of those in the context of the needs. But I also think that it is going to be the state of Texas, the policymakers, they're going to have to look at all of these needs, but the constraints that are around them. And, you can capture water and store it in an aquifer, but if then you're not able to get it back out, there's not going to be that impetus to do those kinds of things.
I'd like to explore that a bit more, because when we look at a water balance on a reservoir or surface water in East Texas, we have a net input of water, whereas in West Texas, of course, it's the other way around. But we have, in some would view, an excess of water in East Texas, but a resounding need along the I-35 corridor and to some extent even further west. How do we plan for that, especially given the regional district planning mode that we've been in so far?
Well, the Trans-Texas Plan always envisioned moving the water from the Sabine River and moving it west. And I think there's some opportunities right now. The folks down in Port Arthur, they had less than a year supply of water to cool those refineries down there, and they're looking at innovative ways that they can get a backstop on that. And they're willing to put money forward to move the water from the Sabine River into the lower Neches River Authority and move that water down. Well, if you can move that water another 20, 25 miles and hit the Trinity River Authority, that's the holy grail of Texas water. And that's where I think the state of Texas needs to be involved, because if we can build a substantial pipeline, put about 600,000 acre-feet of water into that Trinity Basin, you protect the industrial complex in the Houston area for the next century. And that would be something that the state needs to be involved in. Then you can start moving some of the water south and west from there once you have that whole equation figured. So I think that's, again, the value of looking at it from 30,000 feet versus just strictly from a parochial standpoint. There are projects out there. The other thing that we're missing is there's a lot of water that's contiguous to the state of Texas, both in Louisiana and in Oklahoma. We don't have a dialogue going on in Baton Rouge and Oklahoma City or Little Rock about all that water that could flow into the Metroplex area. And the reason being is the region plans, they look primarily at the footprint of the state of Texas, when there's some compensatory issues that we could work out with those folks, make their state lawmakers look a lot brighter, and at the same time we could capture the water for our use. So I think that there's some things that we need to be very aggressive about in trying to figure out how we can forge these relationships.
I suppose there's the the opposite of the NIMBY, not in my backyard. It's maybe the NAMBY, not out of my backyard water's issue.
You get a little of that out of Oklahoma. And
Yeah, I was going to say,
think
there's a dialogue, it's just, it's not a nice one.
Some of that is because of the University of Texas. They play football with that team up in Oklahoma. That's created some problems.
I think it's more local than that. Not out of my backyard is, don't take it out of the lakes to give it to somebody downstream. Don't take it here to take it to there. So again, it's looking more regionally, more, I can't emphasize enough how much I agree with Representative Larson on looking at this from a 30,000-foot level. And I think in the generations, prior to us saw that. El-Sray was created not to build lakes just for lake purposes, but to stop the devastating flooding that was impacting Austin. Just the economic devastation to Austin, but also to have a water supply that would be available. So it was for flood control and water supply. So groups got together that normally wouldn't have gotten together to solve some of those issues. And I think that we're going to have to be kind of like our forefathers and mothers and all get together and try to figure these things out, where it benefits a larger region than just our own backyard.
Mm-hmm.
I just have a comment about your premise, because I think it's sort of an interesting starting point, which I think a lot of people just sort of nodded their head, but I think it's an important question. You started by saying, East Texas has too much water and West Texas has not enough water. What does that mean, too much? That for all the users there are happy, the human users there are happy. That historically, that's a very different climate. It's a very different ecology. That ecology depends on more water than what you see in West Texas. So, I'm not saying that maybe some of that water isn't appropriate to be transferred out, but I think that the key to what Representative Larson was saying is that it has to be a combination of bottom up and top down. So you can't stay at 30,000 feet and be successful, and you can't stay on the ground and only look at your little fiefdom and be successful. When you look at the 30,000 feet level and you think about moving this water around, you then have the obligation to go back down onto the ground and really think about what that's going to look like, because once you put the enormous amount of capital into building this infrastructure, the chances of that water being able to remain in its original basin is almost nothing, because now Houston's used to it, or Dallas is dependent on it, or wherever you're moving it to. So we need to be extremely careful and really look at all the angles before we make these sort of large decisions. It's not in a vacuum. It's not sort of cups of water that you can move around. Things are dependent on that water. Downstream users, just from an LCRA sort of perspective, exactly what Becky is sort of highlighting is that everybody down that stream has sort of depended on that water and has an important use that needs to be represented. That would be the same in anywhere that you're moving water from one basin into the other. So this notion of extra water is something that I sort of butt up against a lot, because I think it's usually a very sort of people-centric view. And when we really look at sort of representing and maintaining what's been in a certain area, including lifestyle, fishing, hunting, all that stuff, you find that level of water that you suddenly thought was extra isn't so extra after all.
Not to be repetitive, but it's another real good example of the inconsistency in water management. The constraints to moving water on the surface westward in Texas are principally legal. But yet, at the same time, a group of investors can drill huge amounts of groundwater and move it westward without any legal impediment at all, hardly. So, once again, we're terribly inconsistent in how we treat it, whether it's on top or underground.
I think you're going to see some movement toward regulating the conjunctive use of water. I think for the future you have to. If you look at the depletions of the surface water out in West Texas and the connectivity it has to the groundwater that's being pumped, and it draws it down a lot faster. I think even more of an illustration is in the hill country, where you see a lot more of the pumping from underground having a devastating impact on the spring flow, which subsequently has an impact in the river flows. So we've got to be smart about it. Most states do look at conjunctive use. We haven't. We've got two separate forms of governance, both on groundwater and surface water. So we're going to have to be smart about it if we're going to sustain the growth that we've got. We've got to utilize the water that we've got available to us now. And then to compound it, and I think Becky hit on it, is we're going to have to figure out how we govern over the new horizon of Texas water, and that's the desalination of brackish water. A lot of groundwater folks are saying, well, no, we haven't modeled it, but you're going to have to come through us if you're going to be able to take some of that water. You have some municipalities in West Texas and in South Texas that are looking at building some large projects, but their biggest concern is, well, how am I going to be treated from the perspective of these groundwater districts? So we're going to have to figure out the governance on that and the governance on the ASRs. The biggest impediment we got in developing underground water storage is the reluctance of folks to go out and store a high volume of water and then have people using the rule of capture to go in and take that water that they stored. So we're going to have to figure out how all of that works. It's not rocket science. It's being done in other parts of the country. We're going to have to replicate that and look at the scarcity that we all faced in 2011, and hopefully we can look at it from a consensus standpoint that we've got to do something a little different.
You know, this issue of not out of my backyard is the one place where we are consistent in groundwater and surface water. Nobody wants their water to be exported to someplace else. The idea of moving water from Louisiana into Texas is at least 70 years old, perhaps older. And in fact, a group of leading Texas investors, including the person for whom the business school here was named after, have had for probably a decade permits to the Louisiana portion of Toledo Bend. Now, understand, Louisiana's water, not Texas. And they were going to move that water over to the Metroplex. It was cleared by every single state agency and official in Louisiana and was about ready to be launched, and the governor vetoed it at the last minute. And so this issue of not out of my backyard is fundamental to moving it, whether it's underground or on the surface.
Well, it's always about a horse trade. Maybe we can find a way to help with coastal restoration in Louisiana in return for some water.
We need to get into a multilateral discussion with those folks and the folks in Oklahoma. If you look at it, there are some trade-offs, and I think if we get in the same room, we can look at regulatory policies, we look at environmental policies, and then there might be some needs for electricity in certain parts of those states. And then also the water issue of bringing some of that water across. They're not using the water. That's the bottom line. This far from the state line of Oklahoma, there's literally millions of acre-feet of water that could be sold into the Metroplex area. It makes the most sense. And I think it's just a matter of creating a dialogue and sitting down with the tribal councils and the folks in Oklahoma City about trying to figure out exactly what they need. And I think that we could probably come to an agreement fairly quickly if the state government got involved. Right now, the Tarrant Regional Water guys are out there on their own, and they're trying to navigate through all of the political issues that you got up in Oklahoma. But I think for the long term, there is a need to work with those, primarily Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana, because of the abundance of water they have in proximity to our border.
Well, one thing I just want to add, one thing that I think is sort of becomes, sort of rises to the surface when we start talking about allowing things out of my backyard, whether it be from Oklahoma into Texas or whether it be from East Texas into the Metroplex, is that, you know, water in some ways is shrinking our communities in terms of, one of the things that we see is that, you know, if I don't want to make a statement for Oklahoma, but, you know, if somebody believed that somebody really, really didn't have water for their basic needs, there may be more of sort of a willingness to allow that water out. But what ends up happening is when you start talking about transferring water, all of a sudden there's this level of accountability for how the people who are going to be benefiting from the transfer are using the water. And so, you know, we saw this very much so in the, you know, these sort of talks of moving of, is it the Natchez Reservoir? the Natchez Reservoir, and just generally moving water from East Texas into Dallas, that suddenly East Texas, they weren't defending saying necessarily that they didn't have enough water, but they weren't willing to lose their water for this sort of perception that Dallas was going to use it for lawns and golf courses. And so I think that that then sort of tips off this notion of priority of uses. And so if we're going to be moving water around, or if we're going to be spending very large amounts of money for, desal and transfer, we really need to make sure that we are doing that for the most critical uses. So it just simply doesn't make sense to be taking all that water and then treating it to drinking water quality standards to put on turf grass. And I think that a lot of that negative reaction is this notion that these communities are not really maximizing their conservation and efficiency. So why is it that we should have to give up our water before that happens? And from a financial standpoint, you don't want to be paying to desalinate water to drinking water quality standards to flush it down the toilet and to put it on lawns. So I think that we really need to think about, when we're thinking about this 30,000 feet and sort of reordering the structure, we really need to make sure that any water that we're paying large amounts of money for is being used for the most important uses. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that that our community and our accountability as far as water is shrinking considerably, and you see that a lot between the rice farmers and the city of Austin. And I think it's a valid point. I think it's an important discussion, and that I do think if we're going to be asking for somebody's water or keeping water from going to them, we need to be able to defend our uses.
Exploring that a bit more, the 56% of the water, I believe by Texas Water Development Board estimates, 56% of the current demand in Texas is agricultural irrigation, and between residential use and agricultural irrigation, I believe it's 85%. And so do you think that this is fundamentally one of the issues that different groups feel that other people aren't using that share as effectively as they could?
Well, most people don't even know what their water bill is. And I think that's really part of the problem. Water is essential for all of life, and we have to be able to provide it at levels that are required for our people to survive. But as we increase these non-essential uses, we should be paying a whole lot more for it than we are today, and perhaps some of that behavior would ultimately change.
That's the classic discussion right now is everybody comes into a natural resource meeting and they always point to ag and looking at the high volume. In some of the groundwater areas, it's up to 70% of the water that's being utilized is for agriculture. I think the farmers have to demonstrate that they are conserving the water in the best way they can. You've seen just a proliferation of the pivot irrigation systems, the eco-drip systems, because not so much because of the use of water, it just makes good business sense. If you got those pumps on and you're overwatering, then you're probably not running your farm the right way. And so that's going to have to be done. But the classic right now is how much water are the oil field companies using to do hydraulic fracking. And you look at it in the Creasle, Wilcox, and the Eagle Ford right now, they're using about 7% of the overall water. Over 60% of the water is being used by ag. And the classic example down in that region is 20 acres of spinach is equivalent, if you look at the full growing season, is equivalent to one frac job. You look at the economic value of that drilling rig, it's about $2.3 million initially, and then if it's fruitful, you're looking at a huge economic impact for the state and the region. Well, that 20 acres of spinach is worth less than $5,000. But you can't deprive the farmer of going in and irrigating that land. So that, and then you look at the electric companies and the volume they use, that's just pass-through water. But everybody's looking out how other folks are using the water, and right now everybody's focused on the municipalities and saying, do you have strong conservation plans in place that when we have drought contingency plans put in place, that you're starting to cut back the amount of watering your lawns? And I think that's a big issue. The problem is the money. If you look at it, most of the municipalities' water systems are within the city structure, and they don't want to see a 30% reduction in their revenues, and so you've got some conflict there as well. So I think changing the culture is going to be a little bit more difficult until people realize that if you can reduce your need by 30% by putting year-round, best water practices year-round. Don't wait for a trigger at a lake or a groundwater source. Just have it year-round, and you're going to be able to save that much water for the long term. You're going to save hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure needs that you can defer to the future. And I think that's the mindset that we've got to have.
Go ahead.
Well, I want to add to that because I've spoken to a lot of different groups, and just recently to quite a few county judges, and then they say, well, what can we do to help? And I think it's education and informing and getting people to understand the value of water. And I think people do not get the value of water yet. It's too easy just to turn it on, and I kind of use the example, it's not a prop, we probably pay $1.50 for this. If we get it at Costco or somewhere, maybe a little bit less. So if you had 100 of these, $150, that's what some people, when we charge water out of a lake, out of the storage in the lakes, it's $150 for an acre foot. So that's an acre of land a foot deep. So to say that's too expensive, but we'll pay for this. So I'm not sure that the general public gets the fact that water is something that we all need, and just trying to point to you're not doing your part or you're not doing your part. I think we all have got to do our part and figure out that we will be creative. I think we also have to recognize that Texas is a semi-arid state. It is not going, there are parts of it that there is not a lot of rainfall, but we've got to maximize and optimize the resources that we have, but also have people understand that value. So I think what Andy said is so true, is getting people to, when you start having to pay relative for the particular uses, I think that value will become apparent to people generally. And that's what it's going to take to fund the state water plan, get the projects done, because it's very problematic. I've said before, finding a way to develop water or finding a project, borrowing the money, those are really the very easy parts of it. But having people want to pay for that is an entirely different story.
We certainly don't value water monetarily by comparison to what perhaps we need to. I'd like to explore the market a little bit more when we think of that spinach farmer, for example. If there were, some have said that if there's an efficient water market in Texas, then the rice farmer that owns, or excuse me, the spinach farmer that owns the rights to that water would find it far more lucrative to sell those rights to the hydraulic fracturing or to the oil and gas company. And do we have a water market, or what can we do to develop a water market to better connect the people who need water and are willing to pay for it with those that have the rights?
I think in certain parts of the state, obviously I think the first entree into that was the Edwards region. When that regulation went in place and they defined the amount of water that was available, we saw water that was worth in 1993 about $400 to $600 an acre foot, and the last group of water that the San Antonio water system bought was at $5,000 an acre foot. Definitely created, and you also create an impetus for the farmers to go out and conserve water. They're probably the greatest conservationists in the Edwards region, because what they did was they put pivot irrigation systems in, they reduced the amount of water, they maintained their yields, and they were able to sell that other acre foot off to the city of San Antonio or other folks that needed the water. So that's truly a water market. If you replicate that across the state, then you're going to see the value of water grow. And Becky and I have had the discussion about the rice farmers, that when you've got a year where you know that you're not going to be able to release the water, do what they've done in other states, and you put that value based on the commodity price of the end of the growing season the previous year, and you do a crop share where you go in and you acquire the water that you're going to have to give them by simply paying them for the price of the crop that they would yield. It's a good deal in the western states because the farmer always knows that they're going to be successful from the standpoint of they're going to have some economic value coming back out. So again, that would be changing what we're doing now, but I think there's a lot of value in creating competition for that same water.
And I think it has existed historically, Andy, just he and I were just kind of whispering about it, but I'm sure it's in other river basins, but years ago, LCRA paid significantly millions of dollars for the water rights that farmers and others held in the lower basin, so that and it was an investment on LCRA's part to try to secure additional priority rights to water so that you could optimize the use over the years. So there has been this trading and selling of water for years, and I think it's going to continue.
Yeah, I would just say that, I mean, I feel like we've sort of touched on this, but we have a significant legal impediment to a water market, and that is we have right of capture for groundwater. What created the Edwards Aquifer, as Representative Larson stated, what created the market was a cap. I mean, I'm not an economist, but you have to have limited goods in order for that price to go up. It is limited. I mean, we don't have unlimited resources, but there isn't sort of a legal structure that sort of recognizes that. So, when we look at sort of what Western states are doing and some of the successes they have, we have to recognize that we have a legal structure that is completely different. When we have something with right of capture, and now we have a newer Supreme Court decision that in fact that water is vested, and potential overregulation might result in a takings, that becomes very difficult for a lot of the things, the ideas that we're really proposing here. Everything from ASR, as we talked about, aquifer storage and recovery, as well as just a water market. So there is a water market in terms of you can in some cases, as Andy mentioned, pump it and sell it, but you're not going to have a true market pressure because unfortunately, until it's all gone. And that's not really, I mean, the problem with markets, if you don't have a good market driver or a cap, is that the value is not going to go up. When we talk about value and pricing of water, the price is not really going to go up until we're out. And then we're going to have this new infrastructure that the prices are going to be passed on. What we essentially would like to do is price it higher before so that people, conserve. So things like, dry year options where we pay people to have dry years, or in the Edwards where we do have a market, we encourage basically through financial means this sort of conservation so they can sell. So what some states have done is if they, because you have to get a permit change for the portion that you sell, they've sort of fast-tracked that permit change. And interestingly, one of the things that states have done is if a rice farmer says, for example, I'm not trying to pick on rice farmers, it's just easy, and puts in some sort of conservation method such that they only need 50% of the water that they did before, they can sell 40% of that water through a fast-tracked initiative, and 10% goes back to the state to put into in-stream flows. Because one of the issues that we have when we're trying to meet our environmental flows targets is that many of these streams are already over-allocated. So the question then becomes, how do we get some of that water back? So there are some very interesting policy initiatives that you can do that combine a market approach but also recognize the importance of in-stream flows. And it sort of allows us to go backwards a little bit because we do have so many over-allocated rivers. But and the last thing I want to say, just to sort of, because I feel like I have to throw it in, is, again, I feel like we have to be a little careful when we talk about market approaches, when you talk about, well, wouldn't the spinach farmer just want to sell to a fracker? I mean, there are a lot of implications to that I think as a community we would really have to think about. Yeah, maybe that's the highest market need for that moment, but what are the long-term costs of that? And I think we're so focused on the money that's coming in that we're not looking at the long-term costs of one user over another. So I just have to throw that in.
Before we end our discussion, I'd like to explore some more of those that can't speak for themselves, the ecosystem, and I would like to say, how do we make sure that they have a place at the table?
Well, I'm glad that you asked that question, because I was going to introduce it even if you hadn't have asked. We need to understand that the environment is a need for water, just as industrial, municipal, agricultural. The environment is a need. And what we have traditionally done is we've said, okay, well, if we have any left, maybe we'll use it for the environment. This is not only an issue of the survival of our ecosystems and our quality of life, it's an important legal consideration. We have the Edwards Aquifer Authority because the federal courts demanded that we put management over the Edwards Aquifer. We're going to have that same issue arise in surface water in Texas if we don't understand that we need to address the environmental needs that water presents. It's a business issue as well as a quality of life issue.
I want to say something that actually looks like I may be in defense of the rice farmers, but again, I think it gets to Amy's point of don't just look at from the 30,000 foot level, but also get down. It's not just about the individual rice farmers. Those are economies down there, but there's also an environmental issue. And one of the things that we've had to look at is, because this is the first year, there wasn't enough water, and so for the most part, the agricultural interests downstreams were not allowed to have any water. We didn't release any. There's a little bit down there. We did some kind of pilot type stuff. But you have a whole ecosystem of the geese and the ducks that come in there in large numbers. They're not going to have the food that's needed. Those rice fields, those wetlands create food for this vast migration. So just looking at it from, well, I don't want those individuals to have the water. There's economies built around that, and there are environmental systems built around that. So I think we've got to be mindful of all of that.
I have a Labrador Retriever that's going to be very, very disappointed if we don't get to spend some time in the rice fields this year.
Well, after living in Louisiana for 23 years, I depend on my annual crawfish boil, which is usually off to the right stuff. One final question. We've talked a lot about policy approaches and legal issues and concerns and problems. To what extent do you think that there are serious technical issues? I, for example, have been working to try to develop a policy approach that would be aided by a National Research Council-like activity. That is, I've been involved in a number of National Research Council committees where a group of experts try to define technological issues or resolve technological issues that might currently impede our ability to develop water supplies. Do you think there's room for that in Texas, or do you think there's a need for that, or do you think that the policy and legal issues are really paramount?
Well, there are some technical issues, primarily dealing with the desalination of brackish water and coastal water. You've got to deal with the concentrate, and so there's a lot of different overtures in trying to reconcile that issue. That's technical in nature. The other aspect is the TCEQ group. If you want to build one, you've got to create a pilot prior to putting in the full implementation of a plant. That's a technical issue. I think that the technology is being used in 130 countries around the world, but in Texas, we're still having to develop pilots. And I think that is a huge impediment from a financial standpoint. And we need to sort of work through some of that, get people comfortable with it. And if it's done properly, there's a lot of water out there for folks to capture.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we've still got a lot to learn about groundwater. There's a whole lot of questions that still rattle the water community as to whether or not there's a gap between Uvalde and New Braunfels, that the water does not flow. I mean, we argue about it interminably. So we still have a lot of science in terms of groundwater that I think is should be at the forefront of our research investments.
Yeah, I would just add one other thing that I notice a lot that people don't sort of, that we as a community don't understand about groundwater is I think that there is, because the way we look at surface water, that it's visible in terms of its sort of refilling and recharging capacity, that there's an assumption a lot of times that you know, an aquifer, if you dewater it and then it rains, it sort of fills back up at whatever, you know, a rate. You just take that number times the rate, when in fact it's considerably more complicated. Old studies of the Edwards, when it was allowed to be dewatered before the Edwards Aquifer Authority came into place, show that once it starts to get dewatered to a certain point, it starts to refill in a totally different way. So the actual groundwater flow dynamics change. So, you know, when we're talking about groundwater management areas and, you know, desired future conditions, and we're going to allow the aquifer to, you know, go down to this level, you know, we need to make sure that the science is there that, okay, well, if we take it down to that level, will it actually fill back up, and will it fill up where we want it to fill up? So that ends up being, and will a bad water line migrate if we have it down that low? So these type of scientific issues are critical when we're actually making policy decisions about how much an aquifer can go down.
I have the great pleasure and privilege of working at the springs in San Marcos. And we have water that is coming out of those springs that fell as rainfall during our recent rains 2 weeks ago. But we also have water coming through those springs that fell as rain 70 years ago in Bracketville. And we have very little understanding of how that whole process works.
We've got the two bookends of the state, the Ogallala and the Gulf State Aquifer. If you look at the 2060 plan to deal with that, they're into perpetual mining. We're in depletion mode on though. We hope that we still have 50% of the water left in the Texas side of the Ogallala. I think that's unacceptable. We need to use science to figure out how we can supplement or augment the recharge there. You've got the playa lakes. We've got huge siltation in most of those playa lakes. If you clean them, intuitively you would think that we're going to get more of a flow. And you do have different flow patterns in the Ogallala as far as recharge. Some of it is ancient, where you get water that's up to 200 years old that they're extracting out of it. Some of it is relatively new water. So we need to use science from a technical standpoint and be smart about that. That water doesn't move. It moves 100 to 130 feet a year. So we're going to take advantage of it, but we need to use, from a technical standpoint, how they're supplementing water in those types of aquifers worldwide.
I think I would add, I mean, I agree with that. I think there's another kind of, science and understanding and education that needs to happen. And it's rarely talked about because it often is somewhat politically incorrect. But we've got a lot of invasive species in this state that take a tremendous amount of water, juniper, mesquite. And I think we're going to have to look at how are those types of species being allowed just to populate without any kind of regulation, and how much water that they are actually consuming. So I think we have vast resources, but we're going to need the science, whether it's groundwater and how does it really operate and replenish, but also on the surface, what are the species of plant and whatever else that are consuming water that is really, not a best use of our water resources.
I was in Dallas this week and had the opportunity to hear a talk by the head of the North Texas Municipal Water District, who said that the biggest expenditure that they made last year was in control of zebra mussels. So there's a tremendous problem, as Becky says, with exotic species both on the landscape and in the water.
Exactly.